Last week I took a trip down to Brighton to say farewell to the oldest working trains on the National Rail network. As of the 21st of May 2023, the Class 313s, built back in the 1970s, are being withdrawn from revenue-earning service. Now I should qualify a couple of things. They aren't the oldest working trains in Britain, and the Underground has many trains that are older, in fact. But these are the oldest trains on National Rail. The number in use has been dwindling, and now there's only a handful left in service with Southern. For me, I first encountered the 313s in service on the North London line, what's now part of the Overground. Back in 2000, I had a job in Islington and I used them to get to work. I recall them being quite cramped, particularly in rush hour. I wasn't entirely sorry when my contract came to an end and I didn't have to use them anymore. I encountered them in other contexts, on the Northern City line and the nascent Overground. But, well, you know how nostalgia is. They announce that that train you hated 20 years ago is being withdrawn and suddenly it doesn't seem so bad. So I thought I'd come down for one last trip. The Class 313s were the first of what's known as the second generation electric multiple units. The first generation was the trains built largely in the 50s and 60s. They had slam doors and on the whole tended to be based on loco-hauled coaching stock. I am generalising here. In the early 70s, British Rail began work on a new kind of train, a high-capacity electric train for use on commuter lines, particularly in the southern region. 3 prototype trains were built. Southern Electric multiple units, at least first-generation ones, tended to be known by 3-letter codes, and these trains were known as PEPs. 2 trains built were 4 PEPs, with 4 coaches, and one was a 2 PEP, with 2 coaches. They introduced many of the features that would be carried over to the 313s. Each coach was constructed as a single unit with no separate underframe. They had rear static brakes, and were joined together by a bar coupler. For passengers, the big differences were sliding doors, fluorescent lighting, and a new kind of seat that consisted of a plastic structure topped with a cushion. Critics of the new train suggested that PEP stood for Pylon Perpendicular. Despite this scepticism, the trains were judged to be basically a success. The lessons learned from them would form the basis of a family of new trains. The Class 313s were designed with a specific job in mind. After half a century of promises, the Great Northern Suburban Network out of King's Cross was finally being electrified. Along with this, in 1975, British Rail had taken over the short line from Drayton Park to Moorgate. Known as the Northern City Line, or the Great Northern and City Railway in its early days, this had been built as an underground line, but unusually was large enough to take full-size trains. What was needed was a train suitable for the lines out to the commuter towns north of London, but also capable of tunnel running. The 313s were built slightly smaller than conventional trains, with a flat roof. They had to meet the safety standards of underground trains. For that reason, they had end doors for evacuation in tunnels. Each motor coach had a separate power supply, and they had tripcocks, which are mechanical devices that automatically apply the brakes if a train passes a signal at danger. They were physically limited to a speed of 30 miles per hour in tunnel. The Great Northern Electric lines used an overhead power supply, but the Northern City Line didn't have space for that. Therefore, the Class 313s were Britain's first dual-voltage trains. They picked up 25 kilovolts AC from overhead wires above ground, then switched to 750 volts from a third rail in tunnel. The first trains went into service in 1976. All were built by British Rail Engineering Limited, or BREL. In addition to the Great Northern services, some units found themselves working on the line from Colchester to Clacton and Walton, and some to the Watford Junction line out of Euston. The trains were modified for the requirements of their lines. For instance, the Colchester line had no third rail, so those pickups were removed. But design moves on. In 2007, the North London line became part of the Overground, and a replacement was sought. This came in the form of the Class 378s, a far more spacious train, better suited to rush hour traffic. In 2010, 19 of the 313s were sent south, where Southern had use for them on their coastway routes around Brighton and Portsmouth. Their pantographs were removed as the Southern commuter lines don't use overhead wiring, and the units were refurbished. It's fair, perhaps even euphemistic, to say that they weren't universally welcomed. These trains were over 30 years old at the time, and even with refurbishment they were showing their age. Given that they were actually replacing 21st century Electrostar units on those routes, commuters in the south justifiably felt like they were being shortchanged. In 2013, number 313121 went into service with Network Rail as a test train. This unit, incidentally, has been earmarked for preservation when the time comes. In 2019, the Great Northern units were taken out of service, replaced by 717s. The 717s are also known by the title of Desiro City, which frankly sounds like a late-night series on American cable TV. That left the Coastway units. In 2017, number 313201, the first unit in service, was repainted in a blue and grey livery, replicating the colours these trains carried on delivery, albeit with light grey doors to meet modern accessibility requirements. This was to be the unit saved for preservation, but the Railway Heritage Designation Advisory Board advised the preservation of 313121 instead, which retained more original features. In 2020, one unit found a very unconventional purpose, acting as a mobile COVID testing station for staff at Brighton. In March 2023, though, the end was announced. With the change of timetable on May the 21st, the last 313s would go out of service. Trains were gradually withdrawn over the following weeks, gaining much attention from train spotters and people on YouTube. So ends the tale of the Class 313s after nearly half a century of service. Based on media coverage and the comments I've received on my own social media, I think feelings about this are mixed. Even rail enthusiasts complain that they're noisy and uncomfortable, and familiarity certainly hasn't convinced commuters that they're a good substitute for more modern trains. But I've also heard positives. People do praise the styling. I was talking to a young viewer the other day who said they were his favourite train. Many of the features they pioneered are now common, if not standard, on commuter trains in Britain. Integral construction, sliding doors, dual voltage, among others. They were revolutionary for the time they were introduced. It's just unfortunate for them that that time has finally passed. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, it would be very kind if you could leave a like and perhaps subscribe for more if the mood takes you. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your always appreciated support. You are the flat roof to my tunnel. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.